At 63 years old, Elias Turner spent almost every dollar he had left on a farm nobody else wanted. The farmhouse was rotting, the well did not work, half the barn roof was green with moss, and the last family who tried to live there had packed their belongings in the middle of the night, after only 11 days. The real estate agent knew that. He just waited until Elias had signed the papers to mention it. "You already bought it," Raymond Cole said, standing safely outside the front door. "So I suppose it doesn't matter now." Elias looked at him. "What doesn't matter?" Raymond's smile disappeared. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Raymond glanced toward the second-floor windows. "If you hear somebody walking upstairs tonight," he took one step backward, "don't follow them." Elias almost laughed. Almost. He had lost a business he spent 38 years building. He had sold his home. He had watched men younger than his own son carry machinery out of a warehouse that used to have his name above the door. Ghost stories were not going to scare him. But before the first night at Hollow Creek Farm was over, Elias would hear something moving through the house. He would find evidence that someone had been inside recently, and he would begin to understand why 87 acres of land had been sold for a price that made no sense. What he did not understand yet was that the strangest thing about Hollow Creek Farm was not what people claimed was inside the house. It was what someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep him from noticing. At 63, Elias Turner arrived at Hollow Creek Farm, with everything he still owned packed into the back of a 12-year-old pickup truck. 2 suitcases, 3 cardboard boxes, a toolbox, a coffee maker wrapped in an old bath towel, and a steel lockbox containing what remained of 38 years of work. He stopped at the end of the driveway. The engine idled. Elias did not move. On the real estate listing, Hollow Creek had been described as a historic rural homestead with tremendous restoration potential. Elias stared through the windshield. Tremendous was doing a lot of work. The farmhouse stood behind 2 enormous maple trees. Once, it had probably been white. Now most of the siding was the color of dirty bone. One corner of the porch had sunk several inches. A shutter beside an upstairs window hung from one hinge and moved whenever the wind touched it. Beyond the house stood an old barn. One side of the roof sagged. Green moss covered the shingles. The fields behind it were barely fields anymore. Brush, weeds, blackberry vines, fence lines disappearing into growth. Farther out, an orchard stood in crooked darkness against the afternoon sky. Elias switched off the engine. Silence filled the truck. Not peaceful silence. Empty silence. No highway. No tractors. No neighboring houses. Not even a dog barking somewhere in the distance. Only wind moving through grass that had not been cut in years. A dark blue Buick sat beside the porch. Raymond Cole was leaning against it. The real estate agent looked at Elias's truck, then at the boxes in the back. His eyebrows lifted. "You brought everything." Elias opened the driver's door. "I told you I was moving in." Raymond gave a small laugh. Elias stepped down. "What?" "Nothing." Didn't sound like nothing. Raymond pushed himself away from the Buick. "I just figured you'd want a contractor through here first. I've been around buildings most of my life. Not buildings like this." Elias looked at the farmhouse again. "What does that mean?" Raymond reached into his pocket. "Means exactly what it sounds like." He held up a ring containing 6 keys. Elias did not take them. The closing had happened less than 3 hours earlier in a county office 15 miles away. 37 signatures. 1 bank transfer. Almost every dollar Elias was willing to risk. And now Raymond suddenly sounded like a man delivering bad news after the warranty had expired. "You didn't talk like this before closing," Elias said. Raymond smiled. It was the professional smile Elias had seen every time he asked why the property had been reduced twice. "Before closing, you were buying. And now you own it." That irritated Elias more than it should have. He took the keys. They were cold in his palm. "How long was this place listed?" "You know how long." "More me." Raymond looked toward the barn. "Little over 2 years. And nobody wanted 87 acres at that price?" "Apparently you did." Elias stared at him. There it was. Not quite an insult, just close enough to one that Raymond could deny it if challenged. Elias had spent 6 months hearing that tone. From bankers. From suppliers. from men who used to return his phone calls within an hour, from buyers walking through his warehouse, discussing his equipment, as if he were not standing 10 feet away. That careful tone people used when they had already decided you were finished. He had grown to hate it. Elias walked toward the porch. The boards complained under his boots. Raymond stayed behind. Elias noticed. He climbed another step. Raymond did not. You coming? I've already been through it. You're the agent. I gave you the photographs. The photographs were taken from 6 feet away from every problem. Raymond almost smiled. Good photography. Elias looked at the front door. The paint around the frame had cracked into thin veins. What aren't you telling me? Raymond's smile disappeared. Nothing. Then come inside. Raymond looked at the door. Not Elias. The door. That was the first thing that genuinely bothered him. Elias inserted the largest key. The lock resisted. He pushed harder. Nothing. He pulled the door toward himself and turned the key again. This time the lock snapped open. The smell reached him before he crossed the threshold. Dust. Vetblaster. Old wood. And something else. Metallic. Cold. Like wet iron. The entry hall was narrow. A staircase climbed immediately along the left wall. Yellow flowered wallpaper peeled away in long strips. An old wooden coat hook was mounted beside the stairs. It moved. Barely. Just a soft little movement against the wall. Up. Elias looked at it. Then at the windows. Closed. He stepped inside. Behind him, Raymond remained on the porch. You really aren't coming in? I told you. I've been inside. When? Raymond hesitated. Only a second. But Elias noticed. A few months ago. A few? Something like that. Elias turned slowly. Raymond looked annoyed now. Not frightened. Almost. What's with the interrogation? I just gave almost every dollar I have left to people who seem very relieved to see this place become my problem. That landed. Raymond said nothing. Elias walked farther into the front room. Furniture had been left behind. A heavy dining table. 2 mismatched chairs. An upright piano with 3 missing keys. A cabinet with 1 glass door broken. Dust covered everything. Elias ran a finger across the table. Thick. Undisturbed. Then he looked toward the staircase. A narrow strip through the dust on the floor was not undisturbed. He crouched. Something had crossed there. Not recently enough to leave a clean footprint, but recently enough that the dust looked thinner. Elias pointed. What's that? Raymond stayed by the door. What's what? You can see it. Probably animals. Animals that use the staircase? Raccoons get into houses. So do people? Raymond's jaw tightened. Property was supposed to be secured. Supposed to be? It was vacant. Elias. Things happen. Elias stood. How long? How long what? How long since somebody lived here? Raymond looked toward his Buick. There it was again. That tiny delay before the answer. The owner before you wasn't living here. I know that. And Samuel Ward died years ago. I know that too. Then what exactly are you asking? Elias stepped closer to the doorway. I'm asking why every time I ask a simple question, you answer a different one. Raymond exhaled. Wind moved across the porch. Somewhere in the house. Wood creaked. Both men heard it. Elias glanced upward. Raymond did not. That bothered Elias even more. You expected that sound. Elias said. Raymond rubbed his hand across his mouth. It's an old house. That's not an answer. Old houses move. Still, not an answer. Raymond looked at him for several seconds. Then he said quietly, the last people who stayed here left after 11 nights. Elias stopped. What people? Couple renting the place. When? Last year. You never mentioned renters. It wasn't relevant to the sale. They left after 11 days. Nights. Elias stared at him. Raymond looked away. Why? They didn't like the house. That's why 87 acres sat on the market for 2 years? No. That's why the price dropped twice? No. Then why are you telling me now? Raymond's patience broke. Because you keep asking. The answer hung between them. Elias felt heat rise into his face. 6 months ago, he would have walked out. He would have told Raymond exactly what he thought of someone withholding something like that until after closing. He might even have called an attorney. 6 months ago, Elias had employees, property, leverage, Option. Today, almost everything he had left was sitting in a pickup truck behind him, and Raymond knew it. Maybe that was the part that made Elias angriest. What happened to them? Elias asked. Raymond lowered his voice. They heard things. Elias almost laughed. You're serious? I'm telling you what they said. What things? Raymond looked toward the staircase. Walking. Elias waited. Upstairs. Mice. They said it wasn't mice. Raccoons. They said it wasn't raccoons. Old floorboards. Raymond shrugged. Maybe. Elias looked up. At the top of the staircase was a narrow hallway. Dark. 5 doorways. Nothing moved. So they heard some floorboards creak and ran away? That's what I'm telling you. No. That's the version you're telling me. Raymond's face hardened. You bought a neglected farmhouse. Elias. Not a murder scene. I didn't say it was. You're acting like somebody tricked you. Elias turned. Raymond immediately realized he had gone too far, but the words were already there. Elias spoke slowly. Did somebody? Neither man moved. Raymond looked away first. No. It should have ended there. It didn't. Because Elias had spent 38 years buying lumber, negotiating contracts, and watching men lie while pretending they were discussing numbers. A good liar usually answered quickly. Raymond had not. Elias stepped onto the first stair. It gave a long, tired groan. He put his hand on the railing. Behind him, Raymond said, Elias. He turned. Raymond was already descending the porch steps. Where are you going? I've got another appointment. You drove 15 miles out here to hand me 6 keys. That's the job. Elias almost laughed. Apparently, Raymond reached the Buick, then stopped. For several seconds, he stood with one hand on the car door. He seemed to be arguing with himself. Finally, he looked back. If you hear something tonight, Elias waited. Raymond glanced toward the second-floor windows. Don't go looking for it. Elias stared at him. Then Raymond got into the Buick. The engine started. Gravel cracked under the tires. Within seconds, the car disappeared behind the trees. Elias remained standing in the doorway. Alone. The wind moved through the grass. A sheet of loose metal on the barn roof lifted and dropped. Clang. Then silence again. Elias looked at the keys in his hand. 38 years. That was how long it had taken to build his old life. Less than 18 months to dismantle it. Now this was what remained. A collapsing farmhouse. A dead orchard. A broken barn. 87 acres nobody wanted. And an agent who had waited until the papers were signed to tell him people had fled the house in the middle of the night. Elias closed his hand around the keys. Fine. He said it to no one. Maybe to Raymond. Maybe to the house. Maybe to every person who had looked at him during the last 6 months, as if 63 were another way of saying finished. He stepped farther inside. The house settled around him. One small creak. Then another. Elias looked toward the staircase. Nothing. He took one more step, and stopped. Near the bottom stair. The dust had been disturbed. He had noticed it before, but not this. At the edge of the disturbed area was a mark in the floor, a narrow scrape, fresh enough that the wood beneath it was lighter than everything around it. Elias crouched, touched it, then looked toward the empty hallway upstairs. A sound came from above him. One floorboard. Creak. Elias slowly stood. Another sound. Farther down the hall. Creak. He stared upward. The house became completely still. Then, a third board groaned, closer to the staircase. Not random. Not all at once. One after another. As if weight were moving from one board to the next. Elias did not climb the stairs. Not yet. He stood at the bottom, listening. For nearly 10 seconds. There was nothing. Then something happened upstairs that made him look at the keys still clenched in his hand. 6 keys. 6 locks. And for the first time since Raymond had driven away, Elias wondered whether owning every key to Hollow Creek Farm necessarily meant he was the only person who could get inside. Upstairs, something moved again. And this time, Elias was certain it had stopped directly above him. Elias did not unpack. Not completely. The suitcases stayed in the truck. So did most of the boxes. He carried in only 3 things. his toolbox, a matrice, and the coffee maker. The coffee maker did not work. The electricity had been shut off months ago. Elias stood in the kitchen staring at the dead outlet. Then he laughed. One short, bitter sound. Of course. 38 years building a business. A house almost paid for. Employees who called him, before they called anyone else. And now he owned 87 acres where he couldn't even make coffee. He took a thermos from the truck and sat on the porch. From there, Hollow Creek looked even worse. Fence wire vanished beneath blackberry vines. The barn leaned slightly toward the east field. The orchard beyond it looked half dead. Nothing about the place suggested a fresh start. It looked like somewhere people came after fresh starts had stopped being available. 6 months earlier, Elias had owned Turner Building Supply outside Dayton. It wasn't a big company, but it was his. 38 years of early mornings. Late invoices. Payroll, Fridays. Broken forklifts. Angry customers and good employees. Then one contract went bad. Then another. A customer stopped paying. Material prices climbed. A loan Elias had personally guaranteed came due. He kept telling everyone the same thing. We'll get through it. He had said it to his employees, his accountant, his son. Eventually, he realized he was saying it mostly to himself. The bank moved faster than hope did. Equipment was sold. The warehouse emptied. Men Elias had worked beside for 15 years, carried their tools to their trucks, and tried not to look at him. His house went next. By the time the debts were settled, Elias still had money, just not enough to rebuild the life everyone remembered him having. His son Daniel offered him the spare bedroom. You don't have to prove anything, Daniel had said. Elias hated that sentence. Not because Daniel meant it cruelly, because he didn't. A spare room sounded safe. That was the danger. 3 months could become a year. A year could become the rest of his life. He imagined waking every morning in his son's house with nowhere he needed to be. No one waiting for him. Nothing, depending on whether he got out of bed. So he searched for the cheapest property he could own without owing anyone. That was how he found Hollow Creek. 87 acres. House. Barn. Orchard. Price reduced twice. Cash preferred. Everyone else had apparently looked at it and walked away. Elias had looked at the price and seen one last chance not to become somebody else's responsibility. Now he wondered if desperation had made him see what he wanted to see. The sun disappeared behind the orchard. Elias carried the mattress upstairs. He chose the bedroom closest to the staircase. Before lying down, he checked every room on the second floor. Empty. He checked every window. Locked. Then every door. Closed. Adzeche. Patruzeci trei. He put the flashlight beside the mattress. Atunci prezece. Patruzeci și șapte. Elias opened his eyes. A floorboard had creaked in the hallway. He stayed still. Another creak, several feet closer. Elias stared at the bedroom door. The knob did not move. A third board groaned. This time directly outside. Then silence. Elias reached slowly for the flashlight, and from the other side of the door, something touched the floor. Elias stayed still for several seconds. The house had gone quiet again. He told himself what Raymond had told him without meaning to. Old houses made noise. Wood expanded. Pipes shifted. Animals moved in walls. Nothing supernatural about any of that. Then the floorboard outside his room creaked again. Closer this time. Elias sat up. The flashlight was already in his hand before he realized he had reached for it. He pointed the beam toward the door. The knob didn't move. No shadow crossed beneath it. Still. Elias listened. One step. A pause. Another. Slow. Deliberate. Not the scratching of an animal. Not the quick movement of a raccoon. It sounded like weight transferring from one board to the next. Elias swung his legs off the mattress. The floor was cold beneath his socks. He stood and opened the door. The hallway was empty. His flashlight beam caught peeling wallpaper. A small table against the wall. And 4 closed doors. At the far end was a 5th. That one was open. Elias stopped. He remembered closing it earlier. He was almost certain. Almost. He moved slowly down the hall. Each step made a different board complain beneath him. The sound was useful. It gave him something to compare. The steps he had heard from bed had been heavier than these. He reached the open doorway. The room beyond was nearly empty. No bed, no dresser, no curtains, only a wooden chair pushed against one wall, and an old braided rug curled at the edges. The air felt colder there. Elias lifted the flashlight toward the ceiling. No holes. No obvious broken window. He checked the frame. The glass was intact. Then he noticed the wall opposite the door. The wallpaper there had faded unevenly around a large rectangular shape. Something had once hung there. A cabinet. A mirror. Maybe a framed photograph. Elias stepped closer. Below the faded outline, the floorboards were scratched. Not old scratches worn smooth with age. These had pale wood showing beneath the darker finish. Fresh. Elias crouched. The marks ran parallel to the wall. About 3 feet long, as if something heavy had recently been dragged. He touched one with his thumb. The exposed wood was clean. He looked around the room again. There was nothing large enough to make them. The chair was too light. The rug had not moved. Elias stood. A sound came from behind him. Knock. He turned so fast the flashlight beam jumped across the ceiling. Nothing in the hallway. Knock. This time he heard it clearly. Not from the hall. From inside the wall. Elias walked toward the sound. Another knock came. 3 feet to his right. He pressed his palm against the wallpaper. Cold plaster. He waited. Nothing. Then somewhere downstairs, a door slammed. Elias swore under his breath and moved into the hallway. The front door was still closed. The kitchen was dark. He descended the stairs, one hand on the railing, listening for movement below. Halfway down, he smelled something strange. Not mold, not dust. Apples, faint but unmistakable. Sweet. Fermented. Like fruit left too long in a cellar. The smell grew stronger near the back of the house. Elias followed it into the kitchen. The pantry door stood open. He had checked that pantry that afternoon. There had been nothing inside except broken shelves and an old broom. Now the broom lay across the kitchen floor. Elias stared at it. A draft could explain the door. The sloping floor could explain the broom. He knew that. He kept listing explanations because listing them made the room feel smaller, more manageable. Then he noticed something near the pantry threshold. Dust had been disturbed. A thin line crossed the floor from the pantry wall toward the kitchen. Not a footprint. Not exactly. More like the edge of something narrow had scraped through it. Elias followed the mark with his flashlight. It disappeared beneath the baseboard. He crouched. The wood paneling along the lower wall had been nailed in place decades ago, except for one section. One nail was newer than the others. Bright metal. No rust. Elias touched it. Someone had opened that wall, recently enough that the nail hadn't aged with the rest of the house. He sat back on his heels. The ghost story suddenly mattered less. Someone had been inside Hollow Creek Farm. Someone had moved something upstairs. Someone had opened a wall downstairs. And nobody had mentioned it. Elias looked toward the dark staircase. For the first time that night, he wished the explanation really was a ghost. Ghosts, at least, didn't need a reason to hide things. Morning made Elias angry. In daylight, the house looked harmless. The hallway where he had heard footsteps was only peeling wallpaper and warped boards. The pantry door that had opened by itself now hung crooked on its hinges. Even the scratches on the upstairs floor seemed less threatening beneath sunlight. Almost embarrassing. Elias had slept less than 2 hours. He made coffee outside on a propane stove and carried it back into the kitchen. Then he looked at the pantry wall. The bright nail was still there. New metal surrounded by wood that had aged for decades. That was not imagination. He pulled it. The panel shifted slightly. Behind it was another layer of wood. Thick. Old. Elias stared at the gap, then stopped. He had already spent one night chasing noises. He was not about to start tearing apart a house because Raymond had filled his head with ghost stories. He needed electricity, water, a roof that did not leak. Real problems. So Elias drove into town. At the hardware store, an elderly cashier read the address on his account form. Hollow Creek Farm? Elias looked up. That bad? The woman stopped writing. Samuel Ward's place. Was? Her name tag said June. She studied him. "You sleeping there?" Elias gave a tired smile. "Why does everybody ask me that?" June did not smile back. The question suddenly stopped being funny. "What happened there?" Elias asked. June folded her arms. "Samuel lived on that farm most of his life. After his wife died, he stopped coming into town much. And people said he started hearing things." Elias felt something tighten behind his ribs. "What things?" June hesitated, walking upstairs. Exactly the words Raymond had used. "Knocking in the walls," she continued. "Doors opening. Did Samuel leave?" "No." "How long did he stay?" "Until the day he died." Elias stared at her. "In the house?" June nodded. "He waited for more." She gave him none. Back at Hollow Creek, Elias decided he was done being frightened by things he could test. He found loose flashing on the roof, a gutter striking the siding, branches scraping an upstairs wall. Then he found an old heating pipe running beside the bedroom. As afternoon sunlight warmed the wall, knock. The pipe expanded. Knock. Elias smiled. One ghost. The pantry door was simpler. The kitchen floor sloped. If the latch missed by even a fraction, gravity pulled the door open. Två. By evening, he almost felt foolish. Old houses did not need ghosts. They only needed enough broken things. At 12:18 that night, Elias woke. Knock. 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 Not upstairs. Below him, he went to the kitchen. The pantry door stood open. That no longer frightened him. Then he stepped inside. And stopped. The air was freezing. Not cool. Freezing. His flashlight moved across the shelves. On the back wall, above the loose panel, were 3 vertical scratches. Elias touched the plaster. Ice cold. Then something moved behind it. Not a knock. A long metallic scrape. It traveled downward inside the wall. Then beneath the kitchen floor, Elias slowly lowered the flashlight. He had explained the roof, the door, even some of the knocking. But this sound had come from somewhere the house should not have had space for. And for the first time, Elias stopped asking whether Hollow Creek was haunted. He started asking a much worse question. What had someone built inside the wall? For the next 6 days, Elias avoided the pantry wall. He told himself he was being practical. The roof leaked. The well was dry. The barn door sagged from one hinge. Half the fence had disappeared beneath blackberry vines. Ghosts, if there were ghosts, could wait. Money could not. Elias wrote a list on a yellow legal pad. Roof. Fence. Well. Barn. Orchard. House. Then he started working the way he had worked his entire life. Harder than necessary. The roof took 2 days. He replaced rotten boards, patched shingles, and climbed the ladder more times than his knees appreciated. When he finally stepped back, the repair looked embarrassingly small. 2 days of labor, 30 feet of roof, 87 acres still broken. The fence was worse. One post pulled free, the next snapped underground. Wire vanished beneath thorns so thick. Elias needed nearly 6 hours to clear 40 yards. At sunset, he looked along the property line. The repaired section disappeared into brush. 40 yards finished. Hundreds waiting. He stopped looking. The well became personal. Elias cleaned the contacts, replaced corroded wire, bought fittings. Fuel. Avolve. More wire. He borrowed a generator from Raymond and primed the old pump. The motor groaned. Nothing came up. He tried again. Nothing. By noon, Elias was sitting on the concrete well cap with 4 receipts folded in his pocket. He took them out, added the numbers, then added them again. The total had not changed. His remaining money had. That afternoon, he attacked the orchard. It was a stupid decision. He knew that halfway through the first tree, dead limbs tangled above him. Vines wrapped trunks. Several trees looked hollow enough to collapse in a strong wind. Elias kept cutting. 1 branch became 5. 5 became 20. His shoulders burned. His back tightened. He kept going. Because stopping felt too much like something else. The warehouse closing. The auction. The bank. Daniel's spare bedroom. Then a heavy limb twisted unexpectedly. Elias jumped backward. His heel caught a buried root. He hit the ground hard. The saw landed several feet away. For a few seconds, he did not move. He stared through the branches at the sky. At 63, falling had become different. There was always a moment before standing when you wondered whether something had finally broken for good. His wrist hurt. His back hurt worse. But he stood. That evening, Elias sat alone at the kitchen table with ice wrapped around his wrist. Receipts covered the wood, roof materials, fence wire, pump parts, fuel, tools. His yellow list lay beside them. Roof check, fence half, well nothing, barn nothing, orchard. He stared at the word. The orchard looked worse now. For the first time, Elias allowed himself to calculate what failure would actually mean. Not bankruptcy. Something more humiliating. Calling Daniel. Admitting he'd spent his savings buying 87 acres he could not manage. Moving into that spare room after all. Elias closed his eyes. Knock. He opened them. 3 seconds passed. Knock. 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 From the pantry. Elias looked toward the doorway. His wrist throbbed. Another 3 knocks. He had spent 6 days repairing everything except the one thing the house kept pointing him toward. Elias slowly removed the ice. He looked at the list, then tore it in half. He stood, picked up the pry bar, and walked into the pantry. The wall was cold beneath his hand. Behind it, something scraped once, then stopped. Elias slid the pry bar beneath the loose panel. This time, he did not stop. Elias started with the loose panel. The pry bar slid beneath the edge easier than he expected. One nail came free, then another. The board pulled away with a dry crack, releasing a pocket of cold air that smelled of dust, iron, and something faintly sweet. Apples again. Elias aimed his flashlight into the opening. Another wall stood behind it. Not plaster. Boards. Rough sawn lumber. Darker than the paneling in front of it, and nailed vertically from floor to ceiling. Someone had covered an older structure, deliberately. Elias set the pry bar down. For the first time, he did not touch anything else. He went outside. The farmhouse was simple enough from the yard. 2 stories. Rectangular footprint. Kitchen projecting slightly from the back. Pantry along the north wall. Elias walked the exterior with a tape measure. 32 feet across. He wrote it on the legal pad. Then he went inside and measured from the opposite kitchen wall to the inside of the pantry. 28 feet and 3 inches. He measured again. Same result. Nearly 4 feet were missing. Elias stood in the pantry staring at the boards. Old houses were modified all the time. Walls moved. Chimneys removed. Closets closed off. There could be a dozen explanations. But 4 feet running the length of a wall was not insulation. It was space. He returned with a hammer. The first board resisted. The second split near the nail. The third came free enough for Elias to see darkness behind it. Not wall cavity. A room. He stopped again. The flashlight beam entered through the narrow opening and disappeared farther than it should have. Elias widened the gap. Dust drifted into the pantry. Behind the boards was a narrow doorway. The original door had been removed. Then the opening nailed shut. Why? Elias pulled 2 more boards loose. Enough to step through sideways. The air inside was colder than the kitchen. He entered carefully. The room was perhaps 3 feet wide and 10 feet long. No windows. No electrical outlets. Shelves covered both walls. A wooden chair sat at the far end beneath a small vent. Dust lay thick on everything. Almost everything. On the lowest shelf were glass jars. Empty. Above them, rusted hand tools. Pruning shears. A soil knife. Lengths of copper wire. An old brass valve. Nothing valuable. Nothing worth hiding. Then Elias saw the metal box. It sat beneath the chair. Dark green. Army surplus. Maybe. A simple latch held it closed. Elias crouched. His wrist still hurt from the fall in the orchard. So he pulled the box toward him with his left hand. The latch opened. Inside were notebooks. Dozens of them. Some thin, some swollen from damp. Each had dates written on the cover. 1958, 1959, 1960, 1961, 1962. Elias picked up the oldest. The cover read, Hollow Creek, 1958, 1964. S. Ward. Samuel Ward. The farmer June had told him about. Elias opened the notebook. The first pages were not personal. Rainfall totals, frost dates, seed orders, cattle weights, notes about fences and hay. He turned faster. More records. Then sketches. A field divided into irregular sections, lines following the hill rather than the property boundaries. Arrows, showing water movement. Small circles marked apple. A heavier blue line began near the upper ridge, crossed beneath the orchard, and ended near the barn. Beside it Samuel had written, Spring line, keep clear. Elias stopped. He turned back to an earlier page. Another note. April 17, spring box running strong after north ditch cleared. He read it twice. The old pump by the barn, the dry pond, the wet smell in the pantry, the metallic scraping beneath the floor. Elias looked toward the brass valve on the shelf, then toward the walls surrounding him. A thought formed slowly. The room had not been built to hide valuables. It had been built around the farm's memory. He opened another notebook. A folded sheet slipped onto the floor. Elias picked it up. It was a hand-drawn map of Hollow Creek Farm, not the map the realtor had given him. This one was covered in arrows, elevations, tree rows, handwritten dates, and watermarks. Near the top of the hill, Samuel had drawn a small square, old spring box. Beside it, in dark pencil, were 6 words. Never let this line close again. Elias sat down on the dusty floor. For a week, he had been trying to bring water to the farm by forcing an old pump to work. Samuel's map suggested something very different. Maybe the farm had never depended on that pump as much as Elias assumed. Maybe the water had once arrived another way, and if Samuel's notes were right, the thing Elias needed most might already be somewhere on the property. Not broken, just buried. Elias stayed in the hidden room until nearly 2 in the morning, not because he was afraid to leave, because every notebook made the farm outside feel different. Samuel Ward had recorded almost everything, not in a polished way. No clean charts, no perfect handwriting, just years of practical observations written wherever there was space. March 3, North Slope thaws first. April 9, water standing below old pear row. May 14, cows favor lower west shade after 3 p.m. October 2, frost missed south orchard again. Elias read slowly. At first, the notes seemed random. Then patterns began appearing. Samuel rarely described a field by size. He described what it did. Held water, lost water, caught wind, stayed cold, dried fast, grew clover, froze early. The modern property map Elias had received at closing showed clean rectangles. Samuel's map did not. His lines curved. They followed hills, tree rows, drainage paths, fence breaks, water, especially water. Elias spread the hand-drawn map across the kitchen table the next morning. He placed the county map beside it. The difference was almost embarrassing. The county map told him what he owned. Samuel's map told him how the place moved. One blue line caught Elias's attention again. Old Spring. It began near the north ridge, dropped through a wooded slope, curved below the orchard, then ended close to the barn, not at the old well, not at the pond, closer to the house than Elias expected. He took one notebook outside. Samuel had written, Spring box cleared, flow restored, lower channel open. Elias walked toward the ridge. The farm looked less random now. He noticed a shallow depression running across the grass, then another, a row of stones almost buried beneath moss. He followed them. The ground became cooler under the trees. Not wet, just different. At the base of the slope, he found a patch of dark green vegetation growing, where the surrounding ground was pale and dry. Elias stopped. Samuel had marked a small square there. Spring box. There was no box, only brush, roots, leaves, and one flat stone half buried in the soil. Elias pulled the brush aside. Another stone appeared. Then another. They formed a rectangle. He knelt and cleared the leaves with his hands. The soil underneath was damp. Very damp. Elias pushed his fingers deeper. Cold water seeped around them. He froze. Not because the amount was impressive. It wasn't. There was barely enough to darken the soil. But Samuel's map had led him to water. Real water. Still there after all these years. Elias spent the next hour clearing carefully. He found the remains of an old stone-lined chamber beneath roots and sediment. A rusted pipe exited one side and disappeared downhill. The opening was completely blocked. Elias did not start digging wildly. For once, he stopped before turning discovery into destruction. He went back to the house. Read more. Samuel had written about cleaning the spring box every few years. About leaves, silt, roots, freezing. One note was underlined twice. Never open the lower line until box runs clear. Elias Turner. That sentence might have saved him hours of work. Maybe days. A week earlier, he would have seen a blocked pipe and attacked it immediately. Now he waited. He returned with a bucket. And trowel. And small brush. Nu shovel. He removed debris slowly. Leaves first. Then soft sediment. Then a knot of fine roots. Water gathered at the bottom of the stone chamber. A thin film at first. Then enough to reflect the sky. Elias watched it for 10 minutes. The level continued rising. He smiled. Not much. Just enough. That afternoon, he followed the old pipe downhill. Sections had vanished. Some had collapsed. In 2 places, roots had pushed through joints. The system was not intact. But it existed. That changed everything. The farm had not been built as a collection of disconnected fields. It had been shaped around relationships. Water to orchard. Orchard to slope. Slope to wind. Pasture to shade. Samuel had spent decades learning those relationships. Elias had spent 1 week trying to overpower them. By sunset, he was back at the kitchen table, with 3 notebooks open. He stopped making a repair list. Instead, he wrote 4 new words. Water, wind, frost, ground. Then he drew a line beneath them. For the first time since buying Hollow Creek, Elias did not feel like the owner of 87 broken acres. He felt like a man who had finally found the instructions. Elias went back to the spring box before sunrise. The water level had risen overnight. Not much, a few inches, but enough to cover the bottom stones. He crouched beside it and watched small bubbles rise through the silt. The spring was still feeding. Samuel had been right. The problem was not the source. The problem was what happened after it left. Elias opened the notebook again. Samuel's notes were brief. Lower, line, slow, clear north bend. Roots near old maple. Check stone channel after storms. Elias followed the route downhill. At first, there was nothing to see. Then the ground dipped slightly. A faint line of darker soil crossed the slope. He scraped away leaves and found a short section of old galvanized pipe. Another section appeared 20 feet farther down. Then nothing. The pipe had either been removed or buried deeper. Elias kept moving, near an old maple. He found the first real blockage. Roots had wrapped around the line so tightly that the metal had bent. One joint had split. Mud packed the inside. Elias sat back on his heels. A week earlier, he would have dragged out a saw, cut everything open, and tried to replace the whole run. This time he stopped. He went back to the notebook. Samuel had drawn a small bypass beside the maple, a hand-dug stone channel. Elias returned to the tree and searched. It took nearly an hour. Then he found it. A shallow trench hidden under leaves, its edges lined with flat stones. The channel was almost completely filled with sediment. Elias began clearing it by hand. No machinery, no major excavation, just leaves, mud, roots, small stones. He worked slowly. By late morning, the upper 10 feet were open. Water from the spring box began to creep into the channel, a thin silver line. Elias followed it downhill. It stopped. Another blockage. He cleared that one too. Then another. The farm did not suddenly come alive. There was no dramatic rush of water, just a narrow stream moving farther than it had the day before. That was enough. By afternoon, the line reached the edge of the orchard. Elias stood beside the first row of old trees and watched water darken the soil around a shallow basin Samuel had drawn on the map. The trees above him looked dead. Gray bark, broken limbs, no fruit. But the water kept spreading slowly beneath the grass. Elias looked back uphill. For days, he had been trying to force water out of a dead pump. All along, the farm had been holding a different system. Gravity, slope, stone, a spring that had never actually stopped. The knowledge was not hidden because it was complicated. It was hidden because nobody had remembered where to look. That evening, Elias returned to the kitchen and crossed WELL off his old repair list. Not because the farm no longer needed reliable water. It did. But because the dead pump was no longer the only answer, he opened Samuel's map again. The blue line now made sense. It was not decoration. It was the farm's backbone, a route connecting the ridge to the orchard to the barn, and the barn to the lower ground. Elias traced it with one finger. He noticed another note beside the orchard. Apple row 3 holds longest in dry years. He looked out the window. The orchard was almost invisible in the evening light. For the first time, he did not see 20 dying trees. He saw a question. If the water system had survived beneath all that neglect, what else had? That night, the house was quiet. No footsteps. No pantry door. No knocking. Elias slept nearly 7 hours. The next morning, he woke before the alarm. Not because something had frightened him, because he wanted to see how far the water had moved. For the next few weeks, Elias carried 3 of Samuel's notebooks everywhere. Water, orchard, pasture. Beside them, he kept his own yellow legal pad. At first, he copied Samuel's observations. Then he began making his own. April 22 water reached lower Apple Row. April 24, north wind strongest across open field. April 27 ground below, old hedge stays cool afternoon. Hollow Creek was becoming less mysterious. Not simpler, more specific. One morning, Elias walked the old fence west of the orchard. He had planned to tear it out. Most posts were rotten anyway. Then he noticed something. The fence did not run straight. It curved around a shallow rise and ended beside a stand of old cedar. Samuel had drawn the same line. Beside it were 4 words. Winter wind breaks here. Elias walked into the open field. Cold wind struck his chest hard enough to push his jacket backward. He stepped behind the cedars. The difference was immediate. Less wind. Warmer air. Then Elias looked toward the orchard. The apple trees stood on the protected side. Samuel had not planted them there because the location looked good. He had planted them there because the land worked differently there. 2 days later, Elias nearly made another mistake. Below the orchard was a wet patch filled with sedges and coarse grass. He hated it. Soft ground. Standing water. Mosquitoes. He had already bought drainage pipe. Then Samuel's notebook stopped him. Low ground holds spring water. Do not cut deep ditch. Elias walked around the edge. Water from the restored spring line slowed there. Vegetation held the soil. Ground below it stayed greener. The useless swamp Elias wanted to drain was helping store water. He stared at the unused drainage pipe beside the barn. For once, money wasted on something he did not need felt cheaper than using it. The orchard held another lesson. Samuel had recorded bloom times, frost damage, and which rows survived dry years. One note stood out. Row 3 blooms late. Protect. Elias counted the rows. The third sat slightly higher. Cold air could settle below it instead of around it. He had nearly cut those trees down during his first week. Now he touched nothing unless he understood why it was there. That became his new rule. Before every job, Elias asked, "What function is this serving? Brush against the barn? Fire risk. Remove it. Brush holding a steep bank? Leave it. Dead limb over a path? Quit it. Old wood decomposing safely? Let it stay. Fence serving no purpose? Don't rebuild it." The strange thing was that Elias began doing less and accomplishing more. The farm still looked rough. The roof was patched. Fields remained untouched. Half the orchard looked dead, but water was moving. Wind was being slowed. Moisture was staying in the ground. And Elias was no longer spending money fighting things he did not understand. One evening, he sat on the porch with Samuel's notebook beside him. For 38 years, Elias had measured progress by what disappeared. Debt, orders, problems. Hollow Creek was teaching him another measure. Sometimes progress was what remained. Water in the soil, cover on the ground, old trees still standing, work that did not need doing. Elias looked toward the orchard. Samuel had marked one tree more often than the others. Tree 17. Late bloom. Hard winter. Still producing. Elias closed the notebook. That tree had looked dead since the day he arrived. Tomorrow morning, he intended to find out whether Samuel had been wrong. Elias waited until the first warm week of spring before cutting into the old apple trees again. This time, he did not bring the chainsaw. He carried pruning shears, a folding saw, Samuel's orchard notebook, and a pocket knife. That was all. The notebook had become specific enough to make him cautious. Row 1, early bloom. Row 3, late bloom. Row 4, weak roots after wet spring. Tree 17, good fruit after hard winter. Tree 17 bothered him. Elias had counted the rows twice. If Samuel's numbering still matched the orchard, Tree 17 was one of the worst-looking trees on the property. Its trunk leaned slightly east. One side was hollow. Several upper limbs were completely dead. Vines had wrapped around the lower branches, so tightly that bark disappeared beneath them. Elias had nearly cut it down during his first week. Now he stood in front of it with the knife in his hand. He chose a branch no thicker than his thumb, scraped the bark lightly. Brown. Dead. He tried another. Brown again. A third. Nothing. Elias lowered the knife. Samuel's note was decades old. The tree had no obligation to still be alive. He moved around the trunk and found a lower branch growing from the protected side. The bark there looked smoother. He scraped carefully. A thin green line appeared beneath the surface. Elias stopped breathing for a second. He scraped again. Green. Not bright. Not vigorous. But alive. He put one hand against the trunk. The gesture embarrassed him immediately. It was a tree. Nothing more. Still. He stayed there. For months. Hollow Creek had given him signs that something remained beneath the neglect. Water under sediment. A windbreak beneath vines. A drainage pattern hidden under grass. Now the orchard had given him another. Life beneath dead-looking bark. Elias did not try to save the whole tree that day. That would have been the old mistake. He removed the vine first. Then clearly dead wood. A crossing branch. A broken limb hanging over the lower structure. He stopped long before the tree looked clean. Samuel's notebook had several warnings about aggressive pruning. Too much at once. Water sprouts. Do not strip old tree bare. Elias listened. Over the next several weeks, he worked through the orchard one tree at a time. Some were dead completely. He marked them with red cloth. No pretending. No miracle. Several others had living tissue low on the trunk, but nothing worth rebuilding above it. A handful looked better than expected. Tree 17 remained, the one he checked most often. Each morning, Elias walked past it on the way to the spring line. At first, nothing changed. Then the bud swelled. Small. Dark. Easy to miss. Elias leaned close enough that his glasses nearly touched the branch. He checked Samuel's notes again. Late bloom. Protect. He smiled. Still late, he said. A cold night came in April. The temperature dropped harder than forecast. Elias spent part of the evening worrying about the orchard, though there was little he could do. By morning, frost coated the lower grass. The trees in the lowest section had taken the worst of it, but row 3 sat slightly higher. Cold air had drained beneath it, exactly as Samuel's notes suggested. Tree 17's buds survived. Days later, the first one opened. 5 pale petals. Nothing spectacular. Elias stood beneath it for several minutes. Then another opened. Then 6 more. By the end of the week, one side of the old tree carried a thin scattering of blossoms. Not enough to call the orchard restored. Not enough to sell anything. Not even enough to guarantee fruit. But Hollow Creek no longer looked dead. That afternoon, Elias drove into town for fence staples. June Mercer was behind the counter. "How's Samuel's place?" Elias almost corrected her. "His place." "Instead," he said. "One of the apple trees bloomed." June stopped counting change. "Which one?" "Third row, leaning east. Hollow on one side." Her expression changed. "Near the old stone basin?" "Yes." June looked toward the window. "Samuel used to bring apples from that tree every fall." Elias said nothing. He drove home slower than usual. When he reached the orchard, the blossoms were still there, moving slightly in the wind. For most of his life, Elias had believed evidence had to be large before it mattered. A signed contract, a paid invoice, a full bank account, a repaired house. Hollow Creek was teaching him to recognize smaller proof. A whetstone, a green layer beneath bark, one surviving bud, one blossom. That night, Elias set an alarm for 5:30. The forecast warned of another cold morning. He wanted to check the orchard before sunrise. Months earlier, Elias had bought the farm because he needed somewhere to go. Now, before falling asleep, he was already thinking about what needed him tomorrow. By the following winter, Hollow Creek Farm had become quieter. Not silent. Old houses were never silent. Elias knew that now. He had learned the sound of the heating pipes expanding after sunset, the sharp tick in the upstairs wall, the loose board outside the bedroom, the pantry door that opened when the kitchen floor shifted just enough beneath it. The metal scrape under the floor had been easier to explain once he understood Samuel's old water system. A section of abandoned pipe ran beneath the kitchen. When temperature changed, the metal moved against a joist. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. The sound that had frightened Elias on his first nights had been steel rubbing against wood. Most mysteries became smaller once he knew where to look. The footsteps upstairs were harder. He tested every board. Several popped under pressure, then released minutes later as the old framing settled. One board near the hallway could transfer sound far enough that a movement near the stairs seemed to come from the opposite end. It was not proof that every step Elias had heard came from the floor, but it was enough to stop him reaching for the flashlight every time the house creaked. Even the smell of apples had an explanation. When Elias cleaned the hidden room completely, he found stains on the lower shelves and traces of dried pulp beneath several old jars. Samuel had stored fruit there. On damp nights, the enclosed room still carried the odor. Elias laughed when he realized that, for months, he had imagined something moving through the house. Instead, part of Samuel's harvest had simply never left it. The town noticed the change before Elias did. People stopped asking whether he was still sleeping there. They started asking about the spring, then the orchard, then whether he planned to sell apples if the surviving trees produced enough. June Mercer came by one afternoon, carrying an old photograph. Samuel stood in it beside the orchard, younger by decades. One hand resting on a wooden crate, filled with fruit. Behind him was tree 17. Elias recognized the lean immediately. He kept the photograph on the kitchen wall, not because he believed Samuel was haunting the house, because someone had spent a lifetime paying attention to a place everyone else eventually stopped seeing. That mattered to him. By January, the farmhouse was no longer something Elias endured. He repaired one bedroom completely, installed reliable heat, rebuilt the pantry shelves, left the doorway to the hidden room open. He saw no reason to seal it again. The notebooks remained inside. So did the old chair. One night, a snowstorm moved across the ridge. Wind pushed against the windows hard enough to make the frames tremble. Elias sat at the kitchen table reviewing his notes for spring. Pruning. Fence repair. Check spring box after thaw. He had almost finished when he heard 3 knocks. Knock. 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 Elias stopped writing. The sound came from the hidden room. Not the upstairs wall. Not beneath the floor. The room. He waited. Nothing. He stood and walked into the pantry. The hidden doorway was open. The room beyond was dark. Elias turned on the light. Shelves. Tools. Notebooks. Chair. Nothing had moved. He checked the vent. No branch against it. Checked the pipe below. Still. He almost went back to the kitchen. Then he noticed a notebook lying partly beneath the chair. Elias frowned. He had catalogued every one. At least he thought he had. He pulled it free. No year was written on the cover. Only Samuel's initials. S. W. Elias sat in the chair and opened it. Most pages were empty. The few written ones came from late in Samuel's life. Less farming data, more short observations. Tree 17 weak but alive. Spring, running after frost. North fence can wait. Then, on the final page, one sentence. Elias read it twice. A farm doesn't need everything fixed at once. It only needs someone to return tomorrow. He sat there for several minutes. Outside. The wind moved across the house. The board shifted. A pipe clicked. The building settled around him. Elias did not know whether he had overlooked the notebook. He probably had. He did not know whether the knocks had come from expanding wood, loose metal, or something he had not found yet. For the first time, he did not need to know. He closed the notebook and carried it into the kitchen. Then he added one line beneath tomorrow's list. Check tree 17 before sunrise. Months earlier. 3 knocks had made him wonder whether he should leave Hollow Creek. Now they reminded him that morning was coming, and that there was something waiting for him when it did. By the second spring, people stopped calling Hollow Creek farm haunted. Not because the stories disappeared. They didn't. June still told customers that Samuel Ward had heard footsteps upstairs. Carl from the feed store still claimed a hired hand once refused to sleep in the house after hearing knocking behind the pantry. And Elias himself could not explain every sound. He simply stopped needing to. The farm had given him larger mysteries. Why one apple row survived frost better than another. Why water held longer below the old cedar line. Why the wet ground near the orchard stayed green after the upper field began drying. Why some jobs mattered and others only made a place look busy. Those questions were enough. One Saturday morning, Daniel came to visit. He had not seen Hollow Creek since the month Elias bought it. Back then, the porch sagged. Brush covered the fence. The orchard looked dead, and his father had looked almost as neglected as the property. Daniel parked beside the barn and stared toward the house. You've done a lot. Elias shook his head. Less than you'd think. They walked toward the orchard. Tree 17 had blossoms again. More than the year before. Not many, but enough that Elias had begun thinning dead wood from 2 neighboring trees as well. Daniel touched the trunk. This is the one? Elias nodded. The one from the notebooks. They kept walking. Elias showed him the spring box. The restored section of stone channel, the old windbreak, the wet ground he had decided not to drain. Daniel listened as Elias explained why each piece mattered. Not because the farm was becoming profitable. It wasn't. Not yet. Maybe never in the way Elias once measured success. But the place was beginning to function again. That afternoon, they sat in the kitchen. Daniel noticed the hidden doorway behind the pantry. You left it open? Didn't see a reason to close it. Inside, Samuel's notebooks remained on the shelves. The final notebook sat separately on the old chair. Daniel picked it up. Elias watched him read the last sentence. A farm doesn't need everything fixed at once. It only needs someone to return tomorrow. Daniel looked at his father. So that's what you found? Elias knew what he meant. The thing inside the house. The thing that had changed everything. Elias looked around the room. The notebooks had given him the spring. The spring had given him the orchard. The orchard had given him work, worth doing. But that was not quite the whole answer. No, he said. Daniel waited. Elias pointed toward the kitchen table. On it sat his own legal pads. A year's worth now. Dates. Water levels. Frost. Pruning notes. Fence repairs. Bud counts. Pasture observations. His handwriting beside Samuel's. I found out he was still learning when he got old. Daniel looked down at the pages. Elias continued. I thought starting over meant knowing what I was doing. He smiled slightly. Turns out it mostly means coming back long enough to learn. That evening, Daniel drove home. Elias stood on the porch until the taillights disappeared. The farm was quiet. Not empty. Quiet. He walked through the orchard before dark. Checked tree 17. Checked the spring. Closed one gate. Opened another. Back inside. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. A year earlier, he had arrived at Hollow Creek because it was the only property cheap enough to buy without debt. He had expected shelter, maybe privacy. Nothing more. Instead, the house had led him to a room nobody used. The room had led him to notebooks nobody read. The notebooks had led him into fields. Everyone had stopped watching. And somewhere in that chain, Elias's life had changed without asking his permission. Not dramatically. There had been no single morning when grief disappeared. No moment when the past stopped mattering. The business was still gone. The house he had sold still belonged to someone else. 38 years had not come back. But tomorrow existed again. That was new. Before bed, Elias set the alarm for 5:20. A cold front was coming. Tree 17 had open blossoms. He wanted to check for frost before sunrise. He turned off the kitchen light. As he passed the pantry, he heard one soft knock from the hidden room. Elias stopped. For a moment, the house was completely still. Then he smiled. "Tomorrow," he said, and went upstairs. Hollow Creek had never given Elias back the life he lost. It gave him something better. A reason to build the next one.